In the aftermath of the War of 1812, the US Navy faced a bit of a problem. Towards the end of the war, with Royal Navy assets freed up by the slackening of war in Europe, significant numbers of third-rate ships of the line, and razes converted from these, had turned up on the US East Coast, effectively blockading the US Navy's frigates in place, since although the latter could outsail a 74-gunner in most conditions, any damage, whether from the weather itself or from a winning encounter with a British frigate, would allow the larger British vessels to catch up and then overpower the US frigates. The situation seemed to call for the US Navy to have its own ships of the line. This wasn't the first time they'd tried. The Continental Navy was supposed to have 3, but ended up building only 1, which they gave away to France in the few years between independence and relations with France breaking down. Next, half a dozen 74s had been ordered in the quasi-war with France, but none had been laid down before it was over. And then, in the War of 1812 itself, a number of ships of the line had been started, but it was clear that 3 or 4 ships just wouldn't cut it. Anyone with a navy big enough to actually come over the Atlantic and cause trouble would have considerably more of them, and the US had more than 4 major ports that needed defending. Thus, further ships were authorised, most as rather interesting second-rate ships with large hulls, 2 full enclosed gun decks, and a full-length spar deck, and 1, built under conditions of secrecy, would be much larger, set to become the US Navy's only first-rate ship of the line. Her designer had copies of plans for the Santissima Trinidad of Spain and the British Royal Sovereign available to him, and he combined what he saw as the best bits of each of these, along with his own ideas, and thus the USS Pennsylvania was laid down in late 1822, and subject to great ornamentation. But, in the fashion typical of Congress for most of the 19th century, the minute the perceived threat receded, so too did any funding to try and stave off the next enemy fleet, and the ship would spend the best part of the next 15 years on the stocks, finally launching in summer 1837. Framed in live oak and planked with white oak, she had 3 full gun decks and a continuous spar deck, pierced for a total of 138 guns. When she was laid down, she would have been the largest sailing warship on the planet by quite some margin, although by the time of her launch other ships had caught up, the contemporary HMS Queen being slightly larger, even if she carried fewer guns. Speaking of guns, Pennsylvania followed a pattern derived from preceding US ships of the line. Instead of multiple decks of long guns of decreasing weight, she was to carry a battery entirely made up of 32-pounder weapons, starting with full-scale long guns on the lowest gun deck and then getting progressively shorter and thus lighter until you reach the spar deck, where carronades would be used. This would give the ship a disadvantage in a long-range gunnery duel, where another first-rate armed with lighter 24, 18 and 12-pounder long guns on their middle and upper gun decks would be able to send more shot at Pennsylvania, but if the ship managed to close the range, the close-range weight of broadside would be utterly devastating. However, she would never actually carry this intended armament, and indeed only actually made a single voyage, from her shipyard to Norfolk Navy Yard to receive copper plating to the underside of her hull, after which she was immediately placed into ordinary, or reserve. Because she sailed without a full crew, without the full armament, or without much in the way of supplies, relatively little can be drawn from her sailing qualities, since her performance fully loaded would have been considerably different. Sitting high out of the water, a ship would be faster than average, but also given to considerable rolling and would be somewhat unmanoeuvrable, and such were the observations that were made. She remained at Norfolk for the rest of her life. After 4 years in ready reserve, she became an accommodation ship, and in 1846 she was listed as having an armament of 90 guns, mostly a variety of 32-pounders on her enclosed gun decks, with 4 8-inch shell guns on each deck as well, and no armament on the open spar deck. She was still there in 1861 when the American Civil War broke out, and was then burned along with a number of other ships to prevent the Confederates taking them over. Burning with her were 3 other ships of the line, and a number of smaller frigates and sloops, including USS Merrimack, which would eventually become CSS Virginia.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.